Now the next part of the story is a little promotion. I am supposed to talk about Olson and Jung, but we already did Olson and Jung once. It was some time ago, maybe it was 4 or 5 days ago, I don't have any idea. I wrote a book. It was my PhD dissertation. It got picked up and published again sometime many years later, called The Secret of the Black Chrysanthemum, stealing its title from the facsimile of that text, which was the towels that Olson wrote his last notes on in the hospital moments before death, or maybe moments after, I'm not sure. The book was subtitled Olson's Use of the something or other of the writings of C.G. Jung. And it's not a Jungian interpretation of Olson, and it's not a claim that Olson's view was Jungian. It was on the basis of really Olson's own scholarly principles of the way he worked with Melville. I went to the store's library, and I copied out into my copies of Jung the marginal notes that Olson had made in his copies of Jung, and I composed the entire thing entirely on what exactly Olson had found in Jung and underlined, and then all the particular places in his own work in which he referred to him in various ways. And I found in the same box that Roy actually talked about, it was a box of papers that Olson put together, which was, he gathered his own notes that represented his thinking that when he transitioned from the first volume of Maximus to what is correctly called Maximus 4, 5, and 6, the so-called second volume in the collected work. And I agreed with whoever it was who said that actually the Maximus, it was Prynne, that the Maximus poems proper are finished at the end of what's the second volume. The rest of them really should have been published in another way, not as Maximus volume 3, as if Olson had put together a volume 3. He had a bunch of papers, and it was sort of the idea that they could be put together chronologically and made into a, so it's all important stuff. And but I also disagree with Prynne that the poem is fundamentally closed. I think it's fundamentally open. And it's like the mountain called Gravelly Hill that Olson has a poem in somewhere in 4, 5, and 6, in which he says, the mountain itself says, it doesn't make so much difference where I run out. If you have a mountain, you don't make a line around the mountain to decide where the mountain ends. The form of the mountain is projected exactly as an automorphism. That is to say, the mountain projects itself through us, and it's perfectly clear what it is, even though it doesn't have a clear boundary. The boundary is a matter of fact, not a matter of logic, which is what I really would like to talk about if I had enough words or enough mind, or if I just sort of spin, which is the actual implications of that, that question of automorphism, and the ontology and the mathematics that are actually behind it and what that's all about. But I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to give this précis of my, well, maybe I'll get to, who knows, you can't tell. Maybe just start to babble again. This box contained not only all the notes that Olson collected himself for the transition between the first book and 4, 5, and Maximus 4, 5, and 6, but a particular sheaf of papers, 5 or 6 of them, in which he said specifically that he was going to take for the metaphysics of his poem Whitehead and for the psychology of the poem Jung, and that he would have to have a greater projection of the archetypal force onto language, language, person, and place. So boink, there was my dissertation, right there. Projection, archetype, libido, person, place, language, and then a final chapter on the self. And that book is available. I have copies, and anybody wants it and want to find out what I actually did with it, you can read the book. I can't, it's just too complicated, and an awful lot of stuff that's involved in it. I would say that those 3 things that you mentioned, the 3 stages of is really, I find it a problem when you take another context of thought like Adorno and in dialectic enlightenment, when those 3 terms are Whitehead's terms. That's those are the stages in the process of compresence of feeling that Whitehead actually gives. So it seems to me it's before you actually locate a man's work in relationship to some general thoughts that come from somewhere else. You want to get as clear as possible exactly how they're situated in his own work, particularly since that was the principle of his own scholarship. That's the way he did it, and which I kind of like. And it's also a principle of automorphism. That is another aspect of what it means for a thing to map onto itself. In the chapter on projection in my book, when we hear the idea of projective verse, the part of it that's almost always emphasized, and certainly is emphasized by all the poets who were doing what they were saying, and would seem to have some connection, is the idea of a projection of energy. And indeed, that projection of energy is emphasized in that text, but there's a whole other side to it, which is this geometrical projection or projective geometry. That is to say, it's a morphological projection. Run all the different rubrics together. The form is never an extension of content, never anything but an extension of content, and nothing is anything but itself, all measured so that whole particular formulation, which he repeats in different places, nothing is anything but itself, is this idea of the object is an object by virtue of projecting itself through the consciousness of the poet into the form that it generates through him, so that the source of form is projective. Any experience that one has when one's attention is allowed to be disciplined by the concrete relationship and experience of objects, will produce a form that is the projection of the thing that's attended to. And so the notion was that you had a source of form in poetry that would indeed have the power of replacing the imposition of form coming from the culture, namely the formal structures of formal verse. Because if you remember, in 1950, the question of free verse versus formal verse was still very, very alive in the culture. Yeah.
Does this have relation also to the previous discussion of imperialism?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard. I was saying this at lunch. It's hard enough to think about imperialism by itself. It's hard enough to think about it also by itself. Let's try to get that straight.
But in terms of not imposing your own forms and
yeah, of course. But come on, that's just sort of like try to actually understand what the damn thing is. And I personally think, yes, indeed, it has enormous ethical and political meaning. But first you have to get to it and not grab off one little piece of it and put it into another kind of discourse and make a judgment about the first thing because you've grabbed off some little fragment of what a guy is saying because the word is the same in the two different places. It drives me crazy. It makes me want to talk in all languages at once. Well, I did that. I had a performance in Prague some years ago in which nobody knew that I was going to do that, and everybody spoke. You know, it was in that part of the world where everybody speaks 14 different languages that nobody else speaks, and I'm talking, and so everybody thought I was talking some other language. It was quite extraordinary, and everybody was quite certain that everybody else in the room understood what I was saying, and it made it so that the total feeling in the room was complete coherence.